In the late 19th century, a rigorous philosophical treatise emerged in India that subjected the foundational texts of the Abrahamic faiths to intense scrutiny. This was the 13th Samulas, a specific chapter within the Satyarth Prakash, written by the Vedic scholar and reformer Swami Dayanand Saraswati. His objective in this chapter was highly specific: to evaluate the Bible from Genesis to Revelation using the lens of Vedic philosophy and rational logic. To understand his critique, we first have to establish the baseline he applied. In Vedic theology, the divine, or God, must possess absolute characteristics. God is Nirakar, meaning completely formless, infinite, omniscient, and eternally bound by both absolute moral justice and the laws of nature. The methodology Dayanand employs is strictly analytical. He structures the text by presenting a direct quotation of a biblical verse, followed immediately by a side-by-side logical deconstruction labeled samikshak, or the reviewer. We will trace this chronological examination from the opening lines of Genesis through the apocalyptic visions of Revelation, examining every major point of friction he identifies. This analysis applies a systematic framework of rationalism and natural law to foreign foundational texts. The critique begins with Genesis 1 and immediately targets the concept of creation from nothing, or ex nihilo. In Vedic thought, something cannot emerge from nothing. Matter and the soul are eternal, meaning creation is a process of organizing existing elements, not conjuring them out of a void. This diagram illustrates the Vedic concept of space, or akasha, which must be a pre-existing, infinite container for any physical object or action to occur. The reviewer points to the biblical claim that God created space, arguing this is a logical impossibility. Without space already existing, a physical creator would have nowhere to exist. He then isolates a chronological error in the text. Genesis describes light and day being created before the sun. According to natural law, illumination cannot predate its causal source. When the text states that God saw the light that it was good, Dayanand flags a severe theological problem. If God has to observe something to evaluate its quality, he lacks prior knowledge. This action violates the attribute of omniscience. Moving to the creation of Adam from dust, a deduction is made. If Adam is a physical, flawed entity formed from matter, and God made Adam in his exact image, then the deity in question must also be physical and subject to material flaws. This material limitation extends into the Garden of Eden narrative. Dayanand questions why a divine being would deliberately plant a tree of knowledge, only to forbid humans from consuming its fruit under threat of death. He notes a stark irony in the text. It is the serpent who tells Eve the truth, that eating the fruit will grant knowledge and open their eyes, not cause their immediate physical death. Under this Vedic logic, the Eden narrative breaks down. It portrays a creator who employs deception, lacks foresight about human behavior, and unjustly punishes humanity for acquiring knowledge. The deconstruction continues with Cain and Abel. Dayanand zeroes in on God's preference for Abel's blood sacrifice of meat over Cain's agricultural offering. A true, formless divine entity has no physical hunger. Favoring the slaughter of an animal over harvested fruit reflects the anthropomorphic appetites and dietary habits of a localized, meat-eating human tribe, not a universal creator. This humanization becomes more pronounced during the narrative of the Nephilim and the Genesis flood. The biblical text explicitly states that he felt regret and grief in his heart for creating humanity, prompting him to drown the earth in rapidly rising water. From a rationalist perspective, an omniscient, perfect being cannot experience regret. Regret requires a realization of error. If a deity knows all outcomes before they occur, there is no possibility for error, and therefore no capacity for grief or regret over past actions. This visualization scales the exact biblical dimensions of Noah's Ark, 300 cubits long, against the volume required for millions of global animal species. The reviewer applies physical constraints here, demonstrating the mathematical impossibility of housing all these species, along with their food and water, inside a vessel of this size. He applies similar logic to the Tower of Babel, where God confuses human language to stop them from building a city. Dayanand views this as a deity acting out of human fear or jealousy regarding humanity's unified progress. The verdict on these early chapters portrays a deity bound by distinct human limitations: fear, jealousy, dietary preferences, and physical constraints point to an invented character rather than divine perfection. The 13th Samuelus refuses to excuse the behavior of the biblical patriarchs. It highlights Abraham instructing Sarah to lie about being his sister, the intoxication and incest of Lot, and Jacob deceiving his blind father for a blessing. To the reviewer, individuals who consistently engage in deceit and severe moral failings are disqualified from acting as legitimate spiritual guides or receiving direct divine revelation. The critique then turns to the covenant of circumcision demanded of Abraham and his descendants. If God created the human body perfectly, demanding its physical alteration implies a flaw in the original design. A perfect creator would not mandate surgical corrections to an anatomical feature they deliberately designed. The text also highlights passages where God appears in physical form and consumes a cooked calf with Abraham. Again, Dayanand argues this firmly roots the narrative in the customs of a localized human society rather than a cosmic reality. Moving into Exodus and Numbers, the text examines the plagues against Egypt and the later divine mandates instructing Moses and the Israelites to slaughter the Midianites, taking the young girls for themselves. Dayanand delivers an absolute condemnation here. A deity or prophet who commands the mass killing of women, children, and animals is acting with profound historical cruelty. Under the metrics of natural justice, such actions are incompatible with a moral, divine presence. In the book of Samuel, God discusses taking up residence in a physical house or temple. This reinforces the core critique. A deity confined to a specific geographical structure is spatially limited, violating the attribute of omnipresence. The historical books also depict acute emotional volatility. In Chronicles, God indiscriminately unleashes a plague that kills 70,000 Israelites. Dayanand points out the erratic nature of a being who vacillates between extreme favor and devastating, sudden wrath. In the book of Job, the logical failure centers on Satan. An omniscient God would not need an adversary to test the loyalty of a follower. The outcome would already be known. Permitting suffering merely to prove a point reflects human ego, not divine wisdom. Shifting focus to the New Testament, the 13th Samuelus addresses the miracles of Jesus, such as healing the sick and feeding multitudes with a few loaves of bread. Vedic philosophy strictly upholds natural law. Events that break the laws of physics are dismissed as impossibilities. Dayanand compares these accounts to the fabrications of modern charlatans used to trap the gullible. This scale visualizes the absolute accountability of karma, an exact system of cause and effect, where individuals are entirely responsible for their actions. The reviewer contrasts this with the Christian doctrine of the forgiveness of sins. Erasing a sin because of a third party's vicarious sacrifice destroys the foundation of objective moral accountability. The text points to Jesus cursing a fig tree for lacking fruit, even though it was not the season for figs. Expecting fruit out of season shows a lack of omniscience, and cursing an inanimate object reveals a lack of emotional control. Finally, the reviewer examines Jesus' agony in the Garden of Gethsemane before his crucifixion. He argues that a truly divine being, or even a highly enlightened yogi, would face death with perfect equanimity, free from fear and sorrow. The conclusion drawn here is twofold. Vicarious forgiveness removes personal responsibility, and the emotional volatility displayed by figures in the text invalidates their claims to ultimate divine enlightenment. The critique concludes with the Book of Revelation and its apocalyptic visions. Dayanand points out the intensely physical, material nature of this supposedly spiritual realm. The text zeroes in on the exact descriptors used: a literal city, a physical throne, and a book sealed with physical stamps that only certain beings can open. He highlights the descriptions of a cosmic war where angels engage in protracted physical combat with a red dragon and Satan. Logically, an omnipresent God cannot sit on a single localized throne. Omnipresence means existing entirely every once at once, which makes a geographical center of power impossible. Furthermore, an omnipotent creator would never need to engage in extended physical warfare with a localized entity like Satan. The very existence of a struggle implies that the creator's power is limited and can be contested. To the reviewer, this is not divine revelation. It is a human projection, a vision stitched together from earthly concepts of monarchy, primitive warfare, and geographical boundaries. The 13th Samuelis applies logical deduction to the biblical text within the intellectual environment of late 19th century India. After dissecting these passages, the source document arrives at a definitive conclusion regarding the origins of the Bible. The source document concludes that the biblical narratives are products of human authorship. The evidence collected across the chapters points to a deity born of localized tribal origins, defined by an anthropomorphic and geographically bound nature, and driven by an emotionally unstable psychology. This brings us to the core thesis of Swami Dayanand Saraswati. He maintained that true dharma, religion, and moral duty must be seamlessly aligned with vidya, the pursuit of scientific and logical truth. The final verdict is strict and uncompromising. Any theology that violates the laws of nature, denies the eternity of matter and the soul, or breaks moral justice cannot be considered divinely authored.